Hello, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library. And I'm really pleased to be here with the Ashland Sustainability Committee to talk about Ashland getting to net zero by 2040. I think it's an exciting time for us to move in that direction. And these people around me are going to show you we're going to do it. So just a couple of things. One is I want to thank the Friends of the Ashland Library for supporting all of our programming. We couldn't do this stuff without them. We are going to have a presentation, and we ask that you hold your questions until the end. During the program, you can certainly put questions in the chat, and we'll be paying attention to that. We will answer them at the end. And then at the end, if you want to unmute or raise your hand, you can also ask live. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it to Chuck Lids, who's going to introduce himself and start the presentation.
Okay, if we get the screen up, yeah, there we go. Thank you. Good evening. I am Charles Lids, better known as Chuck. I've lived in Ashland for the last 7 years. I am officially Professor Emeritus at UMass Medical School, which basically sounds really neat, but basically means I'm retired and I didn't get into too much trouble while I was there. I'm now serving as the executive director, the vice chair of the Ashland Sustainability Committee. Next slide. So more than 2 years ago, the town meeting adopted a goal of the town becoming net zero in greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. This is a fairly ambitious goal because you may notice that the state is saying that we want to do this by 2050. But Ashland, as is not all that unusual, is leading. So we did an inventory of the sources and nature of greenhouse gas emissions in Ashland, which you'll see in a little while. And that's been the basis for our strategy for trying to do something about it. I think it's worth saying that the committee is, after all, just a committee. We can't do it. We need everybody to do it. So it's going to take all of Ashland. And next slide. So if you look at this, and I'll give you just a second to do that. The average person in Ashland, that's the average person, that's not the average adult. The average person generates 9 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's a little fancy term because we're using carbon, this is commonly done where you use carbon dioxide as the base, but for example, methane, which is the key ingredient in natural gas, is many times more strong greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So it's adjusted to that value. As you can see, transportation, many cars and trucks and buses and so forth generate an awful lot of our greenhouse gases, almost as much as, well, not quite as much as all other buildings and so forth, and residential buildings is another big one, and one that we're all involved in, of course. Notice that the town generates relatively small amount of the greenhouse gases. So, you know, we can work with the town and we can work with all the people who work for the town, but that's going to make a small contribution to whatever we're doing. Indeed, That number is probably smaller or will be shortly because both the new public safety building and the Mendez school building, the new Mendez school building, will be both much more energy efficient. So next slide. So this slide shows you 5 different foci of the plan that we need to address. Our energy supply, which is on the left, and Terry's going to talk about that next. Our homes and our buildings, our transportation. We're going to talk some about smart zoning and planning. And then, of course, we will talk about the broader environment and how that might be, is at least one of the ways in which we can minimize our greenhouse gases. Next, Terry Campbell is going to discuss our energy supply. And I think we get the next slide.
So with the energy supply, there are a couple of things we should note in this chart. First, if we take a look at the green line, which is about the middle there and rising, that's the renewables. Notice that's come up to about 21%. It's now the second most significant supply of energy. And so that's good news, looking at how much that's risen over the past few years. Another point of good news in this chart is how much the use of coal, the gold line, which is mostly along the top, has fallen over the past few years. One thing to note, this is across the US. In New England, coal is already less than 1% of the energy supply we have. One point of not so good or bad news is that natural gas usage over the past, looks like 4 decades or more, has risen significantly. So our real focus here on the energy supply is in increasing the energy supply to be 100% renewable. And the idea of electrifying our usage is that our supply can become 100%. Now, one of the things we need to take into account when we're dealing with renewables is we also need battery storage, because that's the typical downside of renewables is the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. And I know there are a few other renewables besides that, but looking at those, and so if we store it, battery storage or other appropriate storage means, then that will level out the peaks and valleys, as well as making sure and covering when it's dark or when the wind's not blowing. So next slide. There are 3 areas we're looking at when it comes to energy supply. One area we've already got progress on is in our Ashland aggregation. What you see is the first choice for your energy supply is that it's already 100% renewable. The opportunity for improvement there is that we could bring more of that local. Right now, we're working on energy credits, so it may be Texas wind energy that's counting towards that 100% renewable. We'd like to get it where we're dealing with wind and solar and other appropriate renewables from New England. So that's the opportunity for improvement in that area. Then we'd like to decrease the dependence on fossil fuels. In the next few slides, Kara is going to talk some about what we can do in our buildings. And one of the areas is that we can get away from natural gas and home heating oil by moving more towards heat pumps, whether they be air or ground-driven heat pumps. But the general idea is we want to electrify our buildings. And again, Kara's going to talk more about that. And then when we go to the next focus is producing more of our energy locally. And we see already that we've got a lot of solar panels around, though I haven't seen much wind in Ashland, wind turbines. The idea with the solar power is we want to take advantage of rooftops and parking lots, areas that are already clear, and we want to use those opportunities for turning that solar power into electricity. So our focus on energy supply is that we can move towards electrifying our energy supply so that when we do things like electric vehicles or heat pumps or other electrification of our buildings and transportation, that we're coming eventually from a renewable supply. And let's see, we'll pick up those questions as we go, but now I'm going to turn it over to Kara to talk about our buildings and how we're going to electrify them.
And we need the next slide.
Kara, unmute.
Kara, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Welcome, I'm Kara Hume. I'm a real estate agent. I'm a mom. I've lived in Ashland for about 10 years now. And I have an environmental background, so I'm pretty passionate about this. And my profession has me in a lot of homes. So there's a lot of things I see that we can do better. And there's a lot of things that I think people don't know. So in our net zero plan, we have taken an assessment, and as Chuck said, we calculated about how many metric tons each person is producing. And one of the other statistics we found was that buildings are the largest source of emissions in Ashland. We need to change this, and we need to evaluate how we heat and cool our buildings, and we need to make them more energy efficient ultimately, and source them with clean energy. So some of the benefits of doing this task is we have improved health outcomes, greater resilience in the face of extreme weather, and we reduce energy costs. So some other stats that show how we need to improve is that only about 2% of homes in Ashland are heated with electric, and the rest is either oil or natural gas. Some other things that factor into this is that the average or the median age of buildings in Ashland is 37 years. So we're dealing with an infrastructure from about 37 years ago. Some of those furnaces and appliances have been updated, but some of them haven't, and some are older than that. So if you could give me the next slide. Next slide, Mina. Thank you. Okay, here we go. So some of the steps in our plan to address this is require large buildings to report and reduce energy use. Really, that's finding out a baseline, understanding our energy use, and then targeting our inefficiencies. And that also allows us to use free programs. That's also advocating for us to use different sorts of building certifications like LEED certification or HERS ratings on homes. So then once we've established baselines and targets, we've also decided that we need to create programs to help owners reduce energy use, we don't expect you to do it all by yourself and incur monumental costs. We know that's not feasible, but we want to provide or help create a vehicle to get us going to reduce energy. So with these programs, we want them to advocate for using programs like Mass Save, which is a great resource. There's even a new program through Mass Save that offers a $10,000 rebate on heat pumps. So that is huge. And part of that is the next step is educating people that these programs are out there and how to use them and what options are best for them. And then through a few other programs, the Ashland Sustainability Committee has collaborated with local vendors like HVAC contractors, solar contractors to create programs that give advantages to Ashland residents to change their heating system or put solar on their home. And then, so that goes a lot with energy conservation, but the other step of this is, or other half of this is using clean energy, which Terry talked a lot about electrifying. And the more we electrify the home, the more it's possible that we can source it with just clean energy, not energy produced from fossil fuels. Next slide, please. All righty. So again, we will need to advocate for and adopt net zero building policies and codes. So there is a lot of legislation, or I shouldn't say a lot, but some legislation that gets pushed up at the state level. And we need to continue supporting that legislation so that whatever regulations or building codes that are that we want our community to adopt, we also want it done on a statewide. We realize that it wouldn't be fair to our residents or our businesses if we were held at at a harder benchmark to hold as far as net zero requirements go. So we've pushed for a net zero stretch code as well as a green building code. And then lastly, we felt it was important to also call out municipal buildings should adopt all of these steps as far as energy conservation as well as electrifying, and they should lead by example. And in doing so, they will show the feasibility of these practices. And we've taken a step in this direction. Our new public safety building has a heat source pump, I believe, as well. So that's kind of cool. Now, I'm going to go to the next slide and say, this is a lot for us to undertake, but there are benefits. Okay, so this is a diagram that I really like to show because it shows how homes are using the energy and our areas to target to become more efficient and cleaner energy source. So a big ticket item, and especially for homes in New England, is going to be heating. So again, that's an opportunity for residents to check in with Mass Save and see how they can do it better. And even with an energy audit, you can see how well or how not well you're doing on that front. So I just like this diagram. It shows you kind of where things go, but I can go to the next slide. Okay, so this next slide, my computer is being a little funky, but I'm pretty sure you guys can see it all just fine. I went on to Mass Save and I typed in for a 2,000 square foot home that is 37 years old, which is the median house age in Ashland, and converting from oil heating and hot water boiler over to a really efficient system. You can see the cost after incentives. So it's reasonable if you're upgrading your furnace anyways. Those are some of the costs. And this is specific to the town of Ashland. And also, if you look on the right, it shows how many metric tons you would be reducing your emissions by, which I think is really cool. And I just thought that was some really good numbers to wrap your head around. And if you go to the next slide. So some of the last bits to call out some of the some of the direct benefits. You're talking about lower energy costs on a monthly basis, which is a monthly saving. You're increasing your home value by making it more desirable. There is a quote here that says, according to the National Association of Home Builders survey, 68% of buyers desire more environmentally friendly choice, with 46% paying up to an additional almost $10,000 for them to save $1,000 on utility bills annually. So I think that's pretty, it shows its value in the long run. It's not just even a short-term lower your utility bills kind of a benefit. And then one of the last direct benefits I thought of, and if you think big picture, if we scale back the investment and spending on fossil fuel infrastructure, like having natural gas go down a road or other things, you're lowering construction costs at the residential level and the municipal level. So I think that's another savings. Yeah. And the other fact I threw on here, which I found interesting, that connects this topic to more of the commercial side, is that according to Energy Star, 30% of commercial building energy consumption is wasted. So it just shows that there's a lot of room to improve on energy efficiency, which is why it's a big part of our plan at the residential level, but also at the commercial level. And I think that is about it for my chapter of this. And I believe Matt is taking over after me.
Thanks, Kara. Yeah, you could advance to the next slide, please. My name is Matt Marshquist. So I work as a user experience designer, and I've lived in town for about 12 years. My first experience volunteering in Ashland was helping to build the raised beds for the community garden. Since then, I've served with many different groups in town, all of them relating to sustainability in some way. The net zero goal is the biggest project I've worked on in my time in town, and it's also the most important. And I definitely want to echo what Chuck said, that we will need everyone's help. So if you are watching this, you will likely take actions in the future to help the town reach net zero. Maybe you'll even take over a leadership role at some point on a specific piece of it. There are a lot of pieces of this puzzle. Tonight, I'm going to talk about two parts of the net zero framework, how we get around, and climate smart zoning and planning. Transportation accounts for more than 40% of Ashland's emissions, with the majority coming from gas-powered vehicles. As you can see in this reverse pyramid, some modes of travel are much more efficient than others. Public transit is more efficient than driving alone, especially during peak periods when the number of passengers is greatest. And walking or biking is the greenest way to travel. If you do have to travel by automobile, carpooling can help you reduce your impact. Next slide, please. The first thing we need to do to reduce our transportation emissions is to promote a walkable and bikeable community, which has connections between pedestrian paths and public transportation. We already have a complete streets plan and the Upper Charles Trail plan. We should continue to advocate for these projects and others like them in order to build connections throughout town. Whenever we can, we do want to encourage housing that is near public transit so that residents have the option to take the train or bus instead of driving. And we'll talk a bit about electric vehicles in the next slides, but these low-tech solutions are really the foundation for reducing our transportation emissions. These are also some of the hardest changes to make, as our town was designed mostly around the needs of automobiles and not humans. It will require creativity and patient advocacy in order to turn Ashland into a pedestrian-first town. We probably won't reach bike commuting levels like Copenhagen, where 50% of the residents bike to work, but we might reach levels close to Davis, California, where 15% of people bike to work. Next slide, please. Because automobiles will continue to be a large share of our transportation, we need to shift to more efficient vehicles. This graphic is from carboncounter.com, which is a tool created at MIT to demonstrate the lifetime cost of ownership and emissions of electric vehicles and other types of cars. Electric vehicles are shown in yellow here, hybrid vehicles are red, and gas-powered vehicles are black. From left to right on the bottom is cost, with the least expensive on the left and the most expensive on the right. And then on the left side of the graph, from bottom to top, is the life cycle emissions per mile, including the manufacturing of the vehicle. So the vehicles near the top create the most emissions, and those near the bottom are the most efficient. There are two dotted lines. The top dotted line is where we need to be in terms of efficiency by 2030 to align with global climate goals, and the bottom line is where we need to be by 2040. So that is the setup of the slide. There are a few things to note here. None of the fossil fuel powered vehicles are efficient enough to reach the goals that we have. Electric vehicles in Massachusetts have about 3 times fewer emissions when compared with gas powered vehicles. And that's even with the current mix of our electric grid. As Terry demonstrated earlier, the grid will continue to become more renewable over time. So this also shows that there are currently available electric models that are cheaper to own after all expenses are considered than most gas-powered vehicles. So that's a nice point. Some of those, the 3 on the left, I think one of them is a Mini Cooper, the other is a Nissan Leaf. You know, those are cheaper than almost all of the fossil fuel vehicles. Globally, electric vehicles made up 7% of car sales last year. A recent poll of Massachusetts residents found that 56% actually expect to buy an EV in the next 5 years. And this is before we begin to consider the targets that manufacturers and governments are setting. You know, most car retailers are now saying they'll be electric, fully electric by 2035. I think that's GM's goal. So these are some big companies that are setting that target. We need to build out the infrastructure to support the expected increase in electric vehicles. That means more public and private charging stations, adoption of EV parking guidelines for new developments, and being creative about marketing EVs to the public to make more people aware of their benefits. Here, I will just do a quick plug for more info about electric vehicles and why they're so much more efficient than internal combustion. Check out the presentation from last month, our electric vehicle future, which can be found on Ashland Library's YouTube channel. Next slide, please. Finally, we need to lead by example in our municipal fleet. The town has a few Nissan Leafs, which are used by various departments now. It should adopt a forward-looking vehicle procurement policy, which considers lifetime ownership costs and benefits for EVs and phases out internal combustion vehicles wherever possible. There will likely be exceptions in many cases for the time being, but that shouldn't stop us from considering EVs for most passenger vehicle needs for the town. And although the school buses we use are not owned by the town, we should begin to explore what it would take to shift our vendor relationships toward EVs. Next slide. Great. So next, I'm going to talk about climate smart zoning and planning. Planning is one of the key levers we can use to help steer the town towards greener and more efficient buildings and transportation. This graph illustrates some of the ways planning can do this. For each housing type, you can see the energy use from traditional transportation and buildings in gray on the left and green automobiles and buildings on the right. And it's clear that low emission vehicles and green buildings reduce energy use. However, even before we consider green technology, we may design our housing, the way we design our housing makes a big impact. So single family attached houses, simply by sharing one wall with the adjacent house, are more efficient. Multifamily buildings are even more efficient without any improvement in insulation or systems. Finally, by building transit-oriented development, including trails and sidewalks with access to public transportation, we can further reduce the emissions from transportation. We can't do all of these things with every project, but we should try to use these tools whenever we can. Next slide. Thank you. One thing we can do in the near future is to review the town processes to ensure that they're in alignment with our net zero goal. Updating our guidelines and best practices does not require modifying the bylaws. We can conduct trainings with the building and planning departments and then craft updates to our processes, which ensure that we are asking the right questions at the right time and tracking the metrics we need to be successful. These include asking about siting for solar, electric vehicle parking, and how we can preserve green space, as well as enhancing the system we have for tracking which houses and buildings have performed upgrades to their heating equipment and which have installed solar. By piloting these changes initially with the building and planning departments, we can better understand the impact of bylaw changes that we will pursue later. Next slide. When we do make bylaw changes, we want to remove barriers to net zero technology where possible. We need to make it easier for those homeowners who would like to make upgrades to do so while keeping reasonable limitations in place. We will also pursue a green code, which incentivizes sustainability features and the preservation of natural resources such as trees. Somerville has a green score in their zoning, which awards points for the ratio of certain green features on a lot after development. The points are weighted differently for more desirable features. So like a large tree would get more points than a new sapling. Another strategy is to offer incentives for the type of development we would like to see. Lexington is considering a bylaw that would reduce the square foot density allowed for most buildings, but provide a density bonus if the building meets certain efficiency requirements. So essentially reducing the density, but restoring it again to the original levels for greener projects. Each of these measures will require careful consideration based on Ashland's needs and the input of residents. We need to understand the impact these changes will have aesthetically, economically, and on equity. We are currently reviewing a list of action items with the planning board to prioritize which actions we think should be a high priority for Ashland. Next slide. So while there are many things we can do as a town, I want to emphasize that we can't do it alone, and we do need to coordinate with other towns and the state. Right now, the state is considering a new opt-in net zero stretch code that would apply to all new construction and major renovations. It's a big improvement over the existing code, but could go further if it prohibited fossil fuel use in new developments. A number of civic and professional groups have gone on the record advocating for strengthening the code this way. Without this, we are limited in what we can require of new developments because the state attorney general has ruled against towns which have tried to impose requirements like gas bans, such as Brooklines, that overlap with the state building code. So any new buildings in town which include fossil fuel systems are likely to need upgrades in the future. So we recommend burdening residents with these future expenses by using all the tools at our disposal to limit new fossil fuel infrastructure. If this stretch code is improved and made available, we would definitely advocate for Ashland to be one of the first towns to adopt it, which will require a town meeting vote. We want to continue to be active participants in the process and make sure our voices are heard. and express our needs to be elected officials. And with that, I will pass it over to Margie. Margie, I think you're on mute.
Thanks for the reminder. Hi, I'm Margie Gassell. I have lived here for about 6 years and I'm a biologist. I've studied humpback whales, free-tailed bats, and snapping shrimps. I worked for the California EPA evaluating chemical contaminants in fish. And as a result of that, I had the unique opportunity to sail to the North Pacific Gyre to examine contaminants and plastics in fish. And tonight I'm going to talk to you about the environment as it relates to climate change and net zero and about waste. So not all means of addressing climate change require technology. Nature-based solutions to climate change involve conserving, restoring, and better managing ecosystems in order to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Wetlands, forests, oceans, and soil all play a crucial role in both absorbing and storing carbon, and thus helping to protect us from climate change. Currently, terrestrial and marine ecosystems absorb about half of the CO2 emissions that humans generate. So nature-based solutions have a key role to play in reducing emissions and boosting the resilience of communities. Next slide, please. Biodiversity is essential to healthy ecosystems, and biodiversity means more than just the number of species. It also includes genetic diversity, which is what enables species to adapt. Nature provides many ecosystem services to humans, and healthy ecosystems are more resilient to climate change and more able to maintain these services on which we depend. Next slide. Unfortunately, environments are being disturbed. All natural habitats are being altered and species are being distressed, and this results in the loss of biodiversity. Some of the reasons this is happening are due to climate change, pollution, exploitation, and changes in land use. But because biodiversity is critical to healthy ecosystems, protecting it can help us adapt to the effects of climate change. Next slide, please. Forests and trees outside forests provide an array of essential ecosystem services. Trees absorb carbon dioxide, they store carbon, and they filter pollutants. After oceans, forests are the world's largest storehouses of carbon, and forests provide habitat to more than half of the world's land-based species. Some of the ecosystem services from forests include oxygen production, air and water purification, carbon storage, soil formation, and recreational, cultural, aesthetic, and spiritual amenities. And they provide food, water, and medicine that support plant and animal communities and human society. Next slide. As a community and as a society, we need to preserve and protect our natural resources. In Ashland, we need to stop clear cutting. To do that, we need to adopt tree protection laws and hire a qualified tree warden to implement them. We need to shift to low impact development and implement green stormwater infrastructure. Next slide. What is low impact development? It's a method of development and stormwater management that uses nature. It emphasizes conservation of natural areas and uses on-site natural features to protect water quality. It minimizes land disturbance, soil compaction, the use of turf grass and impervious areas, and it prevents and mitigates runoff and controls pollutants. Next slide. Green infrastructure, sometimes called green stormwater infrastructure, uses vegetation and soil to harvest and manage stormwater runoff. Some examples are eco roofs, rain gardens, and porous pavement. Examples include a roof that is partially or completely covered with vegetation or made of a white or reflective surface to reflect sunlight and increase cooling. Next slide. Next slide, please. So there are things that we can do on a personal level, and some of them are relatively simple. So for example, we can turn off outdoor light fixtures at night because they have wide-ranging negative effects on insects, and insects are actually critical to healthy ecosystems. We can reduce the size of our lawns and switch to electric mowers. We can decrease the use of chemicals. We can rake our yards, and we can cultivate some natural landscapes in portions of our yard and plant native species. Replacing grass with even a few plants native to our region can save insects and the ecosystems that depend on them. Next slide. I am going to switch gears now and talk about trash. Next slide. Zero waste basically means minimizing the amount of garbage that we create. Everything that we use as consumers has a carbon footprint. The more we buy and throw away stuff, the more energy it takes to make new stuff. In fact, 42% of carbon pollution in the US comes from our stuff, and that includes our food. So zero waste is one of the quickest, easiest, and most effective steps that a community can take to immediately reduce emissions. Next slide. The world generates over 2 billion tons of solid waste per year. That sounds like a lot. It is a lot, and it's expected to grow to 3.4 billion by 2050, which is more than double the growth of the population in the same time period. And you can see from the graph, the illustration that the high-income countries make more trash. So for example, the United States represents only 4% of the world population, but generates 15% of organic waste. Next slide. In 1955, the cover of Life magazine celebrated throwaway living, which was actually a celebration of the rise of single-use products made of plastic cutlery, plastic straws, plastic plates, plastic cups. Since then, the annual production of plastic has increased from 2 million tons in 1950 to 380 million tons in 2015. Next slide. And this is not by chance. This is a situation that has been planned obsolescence by companies that produce products that don't last a long time, forcing us to buy things new. And we also have technology that new features, which are only slightly different, come out every year, and we feel the pressure to upgrade. And what this does is it saves companies from investing more money into producing higher quality products. And in the second case, it allows them to make more money by selling new products. There's also the cost of convenience, which means disposable items typically made from plastic. And plastic is a large contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. In 2015, the emissions were equivalent to nearly 1.8 billion metric tons of CO2. And in addition to that, about 24 million metric tons of plastic enter the aquatic environment each year. Next slide. Next slide, please. Our lifestyles are very much entwined with the use of plastics. In addition to the obvious things like our phones and computers, packaging, and even our clothes, some renewable energy technologies are largely made of plastic, such as wind turbines. So plastic production is ballooning. Next slide, please. And the oil and gas industry actually sees plastics as a means to make up for losses in other markets. So for example, the decreased demands for vehicle fuels. Next slide. US EPA keeps data every year on how much trash we produce. And you can see that containers and packaging make up the largest proportion, and second to that is food. Next slide. More than 85% of greenhouse gas emissions from food actually result from the resources and activities that occur prior to it even entering the landfill. So what that means, especially, is that the land, water, energy, and other inputs produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And then we also have transportation, preparation, storage, and disposal. So at the very least, we can prevent food from going to waste. This would be a powerful action that we could take. And it would save money, lower climate footprint, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and conserve natural resources. Next slide. One thing that we can do with organic waste is to create compost. Click again, please. And if you don't want to do it yourself, it's possible to sign up for a program that Ashland has where you pay for weekly pickup. And it's possible that we can explore perhaps turning this into a municipally supported program in the future. Next slide. So net zero aims to move from a linear economy where we take resources from the earth and then dump them back in when we're done with them, to a circular economy where instead of discarding our resources, we create a system where they can all be fully resumed into the system. And in addition, the responsibility should not fall on the consumers, but should fall on the producers. And along those lines, there are 4 extended producer responsibility bills that are under consideration right now in Massachusetts. And if this is something that you're interested in, you can email us and we can provide you more detailed information. Next slide. So to conclude, I urge all of us to rethink our choices: refuse, reduce, reuse, and so forth. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Chuck. Thank you.
Okay, next slide. Everybody should know that at the May 4th town meeting, which I hope and trust absolutely everyone here will attend, of course, we're going to present the framework we've worked out and hope that the town will adopt it. The warrant will require the select board and the sustainability committee to develop and implement a model for getting to net zero. I want to say about this slide that the 4th point is very important. We need a broad group of the community to work on this. This is not just something that the sustainability committee or even the select board or even the town staff can do. We need all to be in on this. Next slide. So we've been having some things in the chat, some questions, but feel free to use the chat more or to raise your hand for questions. And we would really appreciate your feedback and questions to sustainability@ashlandmass.com.
Hey, Chuck, I wanted to answer one of the early questions in the chat. I don't know if anyone responded, but it was about how large of a battery area would it require to back up a town. I don't have a specific answer to how big, our battery would need to be, but there is a town in New Hampshire, a lot smaller than ours, that Eversource is building a battery backup system for. And the idea isn't to have it run off of the battery for long stretches, but it's kind of like a peak demand situation, or if there's an outage, they would have a backup supply. I think what also is going to happen is in that town, they're looking at making it easier for people to feed the grid with their own batteries. So if they have a car charging or something like that, that could go in reverse and power the grid for a while if they need more energy. If you look at the new Ford F-150 electric, it has a pretty huge battery. They claim it could power your house for 3 days. It's probably not quite that much. But if you have many of those distributed across the country, that can be another source of resilience for the grid.
Just as in addition to that, there are other ways of storing energy other than batteries. One of the oldest ones is pump storage, where you pump water up a mountain when you have a lot of electricity, and then you let it come down and generate energy. The same sort of thing is being considered for hydrogen, that you could split water into hydrogen and oxygen, and when you have enough energy to do that, then when you need it, you can recombine the hydrogen with the oxygen, and that generates heat that can be used to make power. So there are a variety of things. It's not all the storage isn't going to look like, the battery in your electric car.
We do have a couple of raised hands, so I'm going to call on Joel if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of quick things. First, I really want to thank the committee. This is an absolutely great report, and it's the work that you put into this is very clear. These are complicated concepts, and I think you've presented it in a very easy to understand way. So I really thank all of you. This is just great. Having said that, I think I have a couple of points of things that are not listed here that I just wanted to be very brief about commenting on. One is that I didn't feel like you put, or at least I wasn't aware that it was put in context, like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, just came out with their massive new report in the last week or so. And one of the things, I watched their entire press conference, it was like an hour and a half or more. And one of the things they highlighted was that we are, aside from the point that we are in really big trouble here, and they were not shy about, they were not soft pedaling this, let me put it that way. What they pointed out was that to actually achieve the not so great 1.5 degree temperature rise, and we're currently we're going to blow by that by a lot, and we can't. We need to reduce our emissions by 43%, according to them, by 2030. So that would be one question, at least to put in context the timeline that you envision if we realistically move down and move all of these things into position, and we have an effective rollout of this program to the residents. Will we come even close to achieving that? So that's kind of one question. The only other two things I wanted to emphasize, and I've spoken to the committee about this before, if you take one cow and you put it out on and let it graze on, roughly it would need 4 or 5 acres of land. You will, slaughtering that cow and using it for food, you will get about 450 pounds. That's the average per cow that's grown for food. On that same land, you could generate 140,000 pounds of vegetables. So just put that in perspective of, I think that for us to ignore what our diet is, and this isn't just obviously an Ashland issue, but somewhere education has to start happening. And I would see that as one of the many roles of the Sustainability Committee, look into the data, see what you find is credible. And if so, it's not that we're putting in mandates of what people will eat, but we want to inform the public that there might be some climate benefits and very significant climate benefits.
Joel, I'm going to interrupt you and ask if anybody on the committee has any comments about what you've been saying or asking.
I can respond to the diet piece. I think there definitely is plenty of evidence that a vegetarian diet is lower emissions, it's more sustainable in many ways. So I think there is a cultural piece, in terms of educating people and kind of making the case for adopting more vegetarian options, maybe not full scale switch to veganism, but the less meat you eat, the lower your impact.
Thank you.
I just, to extend that diet comment, I was working frequently in the UK before the pandemic for about 3 years, and it was a common topic on the BBC 4 talk channel. So I haven't heard that level of conversation on our NPR or anything like that. Not to say there's not an occasional discussion, but it was an almost everyday topic. in the UK. So,
Yes.
so it can be, Joel, you're right. It can be, and we need to think about how we make that happen, how we increase the dialogue here in the States.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to shoot my mouth off on the subject too.
Oh.
The
Oh,
one
go ahead,
thing
Jeff.
that's also relevant is that cows belch, and not at the other end, but they belch methane, which is, as we've noted, a very strong greenhouse gas. However, it depends on what they eat. If they eat grass, they don't do it nearly as much as if they're fed in these big, fed corn and soybeans in big mass-produced operations. Nonetheless, your point's well taken, Joel.
I just want to make one quick comment about that because that's a popular thing, meatless Mondays. Could we compromise? Could we do a little? Could we have grass-fed cows naturally grazing? Grass-fed cows, due to the land use that Margie talked about at great length and very articulately, are way worse than for the climate than factory farming, which I don't advocate at all. But it is not the solution. You can't just throw cows out in the field and let them eat. Anyway, one very last quick comment. I really thank you for including something in there about, I don't know how you worded it, but the whole issue of trying to preserve trees in Ashland. We are not doing that. I was out with a large developer yesterday, and they were eyeing a very, very large piece of property in Ashland. It's all trees. We are about to cut down all the old trees right next to on Memorial Drive to put in a senior housing up there. I'm all for housing. I'm all for these great objectives that we have. We are not giving any consideration to the cutting down of trees whatsoever. In 2016, I wrote on the town's site.
Joel, I'm going to stop you there because we have a bunch more questions, but I definitely
Thank
know
you.
that we are.
Let me just say, we need a trees bylaw, and we need it immediately, not like in a year or two, or, let's think about it. Let's do it, put it in today. We can always modify it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now I see that Mark has his hand raised, and then we'll go to questions in the chat.
Hey, thank you. Good evening all. Dr. Sony, 49 Hawthorne Road. And a great presentation that is well distinct and well specified in every step of the way. My question would be down the road for in the planning stage for how would you work with developers with multifamily, excuse me, multifamily mixed use, and how well would you want to talk to them about the net zero plans to them? That's it.
Matt, do you want to respond?
Sure. Yeah. I think there's definitely a need to kind of engage with developers as we work on these things. So the goal in making planning changes would be to make our buildings more sustainable while still making it possible to develop a good project. We don't want to kind of shut everything down completely. So there's a balance you have to strike, in terms of affordable housing, in terms of sustainable housing. So I think, we want to move towards more sustainable projects, but also still in the character of town. So I mean, it's kind of a complicated, I'm not really able to give you a specific right now, but I think it's a conversation that would happen between planning, the sustainability committee, people in town, like what types of projects do we want to see? I know that people have a reaction to density, that feels very out of the character of the town. But obviously, from that graph, you can see sustainability does involve becoming more dense in some ways if you're trying to preserve open space. So I think there's a room for it, but we have to do it in a careful and thoughtful way.
I'm going to go back to some of the questions that were in the chat when you first started your presentation. Robert asked, how large would a battery area be to back up the entire town?
Yeah, I think I kind of answered that one. I think it's the town in New Hampshire, if you want to look it up, Westmoreland. But yeah, I think it's still kind of to be determined what the grid of the future will look like.
Mm-hmm. And Mary asked, how do you get an energy audit?
Well, Mass Save does energy audits, and you can get them online. It's not perhaps as thorough as you might get if you want to hire a specialty consultant, but they do a nice job of, at least raising many of the issues. And they will, in the process, also provide you with some specific types of support, particularly in terms of air sealing.
Okay. All right, go ahead.
I'm just going to jump in. It also depends on what you're looking to do with it. Mass Save is free, so it's a great first option. Something else to consider is the Pearl certification. It's actually a free app that homeowners can download and enter in their own data, and that's another option. There's probably more out there than people have any idea about, but those are two good ones to start with.
Did you say pearl as in like the necklace? Okay.
Yep.
Great. Are there any barriers presently in Ashland's building codes for homeowners to install backyard solar installations or even wind? Because the person who asked the question said their roof isn't great for solar.
Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my understanding is that the state rules allow solar, but it is true, it may only be on roofs that they allow that. I don't know what the current code is. It's a good question.
Yeah,
I have seen something in the area where there are panels in a side yard.
Mhm.
That may not be in Ashland, but I've seen that in driving around some of the local area.
Yeah, I think it may require a special permit. It's not by right the same way that maybe rooftop solar would be. And the incentives might be different too. I'm not sure if it's the same match from the state. But I'm not an expert. I haven't installed ground mounted solar myself, so I don't know the details on it.
Is a plan being developed to assist retired homeowners in any energy saving upgrades? I spent a lot of to upgrade from an old oil system to natural gas a few years ago.
So I think a lot of the plans that exist through Mass Save apply to anyone that's a homeowner. So if you've already done them, the upgrades, I think that's hard to get the incentives now, but that's why we advocate for people to get the energy audit first and then find out what incentives exist. And if you look at the link that I think Matt put in the chat, you can actually go on to the Mass Save website and see if you were to take your current stats of your home and plug it in, what kind of savings and incentives would apply to you. Yeah, and it briefly describes the efficiency of your current systems.
I see that Rob has raised his hand. So Rob, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, I actually have a couple of comments. First of all, we just completed the Metro West Green Energy Challenge in town that ran for about 6 months. And it's still right now, the companies, there's 3 different companies, a solar company and 2 heat pump companies that participated in that. They're still honoring their pricing, which is about 15% below the going price. And they are reputable, well-qualified companies that if you have a question about heat pumps or solar systems, I would suggest you look them up on the web, and if you can't find them, you can go to the sustainability committee and they'll be able to help you. So there was one comment. What was the other one? Oh yeah, on Mass Save, I want to mention that Mass Save is good, and but they hire contractors. So the number of different contractors that do mass save audits, and in order for you to make sure that you have a reputable one, they're not all the same. They're really not, and some of them have had a lot of problems. I would also go and check in with the sustainability committee. We've talked to different people, and some of them are definitely better than others. And there are also different levels that you can request your energy audit for mass save. They all provide basically the same functions, but some of them stand behind their process much better than others. And some of them will also do better tests, like a blower door test. That's important if you want to know about that. So I would check into that. So
thank you, Rob.
Okay.
I don't know if there was a question in there, but there were some good comments and suggestions.
Okay.
Joel asked, can you mention the impact on indoor air quality and public health when gas stoves are used in the home?
Yeah, I can certainly talk to that. It's a little known thing, but asthma in children is directly related to having gas stoves in the home. Everybody thinks, oh, gas is so wonderful for cooking. It actually leaks gas, although admittedly minor amounts, even when it's not turned on. So if you have a gas stove, you really want to make sure you have a good air exchanger, which is maybe another point to be made, that if you tighten up your house a lot and we have a very tight house, we have to have an air exchanger system of which there are commercial ones that if anybody is worried about that, I can provide at least a little help.
I'll just add to this. If you're concerned you have gas and you don't have venting, a good quick solution is to pick up like an induction cooktop burner. They sell them at IKEA for $80. You can get them on Amazon from various vendors, but we have a little portable one that plugs into any regular outlet, and it's a good way to kind of get experience with induction cooking and to avoid using gas if there's considerably a safety issue there for you.
And even if it's not, the disadvantage of induction cooking is you have to throw away your aluminum pots. But after you've done that, it's much faster. You got better control over it. It's cheaper. I know people think, oh, gas is such a wonderful cooking thing. Induction cooktops are much more efficient.
I see Mark has his hand raised, so I'm going to ask you to unmute. Ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Again, Mark Tesoro. I would like to ask the committee and all involved in the call here is, I know I've been following this for a good amount of time with the Sustainability Committee. Can you say in a good recap that how did you get started in this and who was the other informationers that got involved in getting this started? That's my question.
Well, the committee started a long time ago, but I think the net zero initiative really started to take off with the latest, the 2018 IPCC report. And Joel actually came to one of our meetings and was pushing us to adopt a big goal around emissions for the town. So we started having some informal conversations just as a sustainability committee, and then kind of expanded out. And since then, we've worked with almost every committee in town. We've presented to them and looked for areas of overlap. We're working pretty closely with the planning board. And we also partnered with MAPC, which is a regional group, and they've put together some great guidance on net zero and some best practices. So we've been able to learn from them along the way. So it started with us, but it's been a real education process, and we've been pulling in people as we go. It's not the same group that started, and anyone who's listening, if you want to come to one of our meetings, you're welcome to come and learn more about what we're up to.
Okay, thank you. Robert asks, what is the preferred method to heat a house with electricity? Direct electric heat or forced hot water heated by electricity?
No.
I think that's a house by house basis. I mean, you have to consider whether this is an existing home, if it's a brand new home. I think that's where the energy audit really comes into play. I think you have to talk to an HVAC contractor and find out what their opinion is. I think it's going to vary from home to home.
I think that's true. I also think I would add that in general, you want a heat pump rather than electric resistance heating, because electric resistance heating is expensive and heat pumps are about essential. Well, right this moment with the current price of gas and electricity, heat pumps are a little cheaper than gas and significantly cheaper than oil.
I think that's all of the questions that we've had. I don't see any hands raised or additional questions in the chat. So I wanted to say thank you for doing this amazing presentation and educating us all on where we're at and what we need to do next. I don't know if you have any last comments that you would like to say before we head out. I know Robert just asked what size area of yard is needed for a GSHP. And Elizabeth says she'd love this presentation.
For the ground source heat pump, I don't know. I think email the committee, but it's not as big as you might think because they're drilling straight down usually for the closed loop system. Yeah, that's a quick answer there.
Thank you. So I do want to tell everybody that we have recorded. I will send out a recap with the recording and any resources that the committee has shared with their email address and all of that, as well as some information. I know Matthew had said that we have a YouTube channel, and we also had a program recently on net carbon home, which had a lot of resources on heat pumps and things like that. So I'll be happy to share those links with you in a recap. So thank you, committee, for being here, Margie, Kara, Chuck, Matthew, and Terry. And I appreciate everybody who spent some time with us this evening learning, and I look forward to seeing you at town meeting on May 4th, which is also Star Wars Day. May the 4th be with you. So have a wonderful night, everybody.
Thank you.
Night.